Today is November 23rd, 2009. I am Sierra Haskett interviewing Alberta Morgan at Ball State University. This is tape 1 of 1. So I want to begin with your childhood.
Okay.
Where and when were you born?
Okay, I was born actually in Muncie, Indiana in 1950. My parents lived in Selma, which is just a little farm town that's about 6 or 7 miles from here, east of Muncie.
Do you have any siblings?
I do. I have 2 brothers and 2 sisters.
And how old are they compared to you?
Well, one of my sisters, who was from my mother's previous marriage, is 7 years older than I. The others were stair steps, and I'm the oldest, and then my sister, and then my 2 brothers. And we're all just about a year and a half apart.
Can you describe your mom?
Now, you want to know what she's like now? She's still alive. She'll be 86 this year, and she's one of the feistiest women I've ever met. She was born deaf, as were her 10 brothers and sisters. The biggest part of them were various stages of deaf, but most of them are completely deaf. And so I was raised by a deaf woman who didn't sign. She read lips, and very well. And so I was, as the oldest, was kind of her voice to the world, I think, and still am a lot.
And what was she like then?
She was very strict, a sign of her times, I think. She worked hard. She generally either had jobs outside, of course she was deaf, and back then there wasn't a lot of understanding of those sorts of things, or she did ironing in the home for 10 cents a piece, but somehow they always made it work with 4 kids. And she canned, and she did all that kind of thing.
Can you describe your father?
He was a factory worker. He's from Kentucky. He's illiterate. The only thing he can write is his name, and he can't read anything. He came up here to Indiana from Kentucky to get a job. He served in the Navy during the Korean War. And then he came back, and his job was waiting for him. He worked at Broderick's, which is a company that now is pretty much defunct here. He worked his way up to foreman, and they gave him a clerk because he couldn't read or write. And, of course, there's some paperwork. And he worked there his whole life. He always worked second shift, so everybody in town knew he left at 3 o'clock. He was a pretty mean man, still is. He's still alive. We were pretty much afraid of him and happy when 3 o'clock came around that he left to go to work.
So you would have been considered working class?
Yes.
Was your parents' relationship a good relationship?
No, not at all. They fought a lot of it physical. It was not, I don't know exactly why they stay together. They still do, but they still fight and argue, but there's something there. There's a connection. Occasionally you'll see it.
So were you a close family, would you say?
And I would say that the 4 kids were close. It was sort of us against them, kind of a world. But yeah, we were pretty supportive of each other and protective.
Where did you attend high school?
I attended high school in Selma, and when I was a senior, I was the first class that was in Wapahani, which was a consolidation of a couple of schools. So I was there from most of my life.
Okay. What kind of activities were you involved in?
Well, I was in Future Homemakers of America, which almost everybody was. I did volunteering at the local county home, which was for elderly people. I was in drama club. I was in band. Band was probably my major activity.
How did you play?
I played clarinet. And had a lot of connections with Ball State, actually, back then because of the bands. Our band director was Joseph Scagnoli, who was from Ball State, and of course he brought a lot of the Ball State band to our school to help us, and we were the #1 band in the state most of the time when I was in high school.
Can you describe some of your close friendships?
Yes, I had 2 or 3 girls that we all grew up together, and we were all friends until we got in high school, and then it was kind of, people paired off. Back then, most people were either engaged or were going to get married by the time they were graduating during that time, particularly during the war years. And so then most of my friends were guys. My friends were guys. The ones my age were the ones that were my friends. And then the guy that I dated was about 2 or 3 years older than me.
What did you do for fun in Selma?
Well, we sat by the pop machine on the hoods of our cars and looked at the stars and talked about what we thought was out there and that kind of thing. We drove into Muncie. Gas was like 17 cents a gallon or so, and so we'd pool our change and put a couple gallons in and drive into Muncie and drive around John's Awful Drive-In and the Big Boy, and they were on opposite ends of Muncie, so you just made a big circle and sat in John's Awful and watched the guys drive by.
When did you become aware of the war?
I think for me, the war started when I was 15, and that was in 1965. I knew that there was a war, of course, but we didn't have instant TV, instant news reportage and all of that then, and it really didn't, it wasn't in your face like things are now. But when I was 15 is when my boyfriend got drafted. Well, he was going to get drafted, so he joined the Marines. So that's when it really became real to me.
How did you feel about it?
I think at that time it still wasn't very real. I didn't understand war at all, of course, and I don't think I thought much about it, about what it really was, or I had no idea.
Did the war change the atmosphere at school and at home? If so, in what ways?
Well, I don't know that it did at home so much, but it certainly did in the bigger world and in school, because all of the boys that I was in high school with were pretty sure they were probably going to get drafted. And so they were, by the time they were getting close to being seniors, they were making decisions about, do I wait to get drafted and hope for the best, or do I join and then have some control over, what branch of service I'm in and maybe what job I have and that kind of thing. So that was a big issue. And you were always hearing about somebody got the letter, telling them to report.
How did you meet Ronnie, and what was he like?
In a small town like that, you sort of always know people. But I really got to know him because he was a friend of a friend, and we were doing one of those sit on the hood of the car and talk about life kind of nights, and he was there. And he was fun, but he was sort of mature beyond his age. His dream, when everybody else was dreaming about, having fancy cars or those things that high school kids do, he was dreaming about, he always wanted to get married and have a house and have a little boy. And that was always his fantasy. So he was a little bit more mature, and he was a little older than me too. So he was pretty protective. And I remember one time he sent me home because he thought my skirt was too short. And he was my boyfriend, So, but at that time, back then, you thought that was kind of cool, he was protective.
So what did you like about him?
Well, he was certainly good looking. He had dark curly hair and big blue eyes. He was big. I liked that, and I liked that he was fun. He liked to play basketball. He was protective. Like I said, I think that, the knight in shining armor kind of thing that we all sort of believed in. He was that. He was really comfortable with my family and understood my family, and that's good. When you've got sort of a crazy family, you need somebody that can adjust to that, and he could.
Did you get along with his family?
Yes, I got along with him, but I wasn't close with him. And I think part of that is you didn't hang out at your boyfriend's house back then, you know. But like before we went to prom, we went to his uncle's and they did video, and you know, so it was just kind of a friendly relationship.
Can you describe his background?
It's probably pretty similar. His father was a factory worker. His mother was a stay-at-home mother. He was the oldest. He had a little brother and sister. His sister actually was my age and in my class. They lived kind of a little, it's funny, but kind of out in the country from Selma. Selma was the metropolis out there in the cornfields. And he lived about a mile from my house, so it was kind of out in the country. And they lived in a small little kind of cracker box kind of a house, and just kind of average people.
How did he feel about the war?
I think he felt a responsibility. He was a little scared, but excited. And I think that he and his two friends that they had a pact to go in together. I think they got each other kind of excited and pumped up about it a little more than would have been normal. I think he saw it as something he needed to do and get through, and then he could live his life.
What kind of conversations did you have about the war with him, if any?
We talked about it a lot. But are you talking about before he went?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. We talked about should I or shouldn't I kind of questions, you know. He was leaning towards the Marines, and the Marines were really, they had a rep, I think, of being the tough guys, you know, the really go-get-'em guys, and I think he bought into that completely. I was kind of, well, why don't you wait and see, you know, it's a chance, there's a chance, you know, that you'll be overlooked, and he didn't think that was a very far-seeing way of thinking about it. And my final view with him was, you need to do what you need to do, and then I'll work with that whichever way it happens, because I really felt that it was his choice.
When and why, well, when did he make the decision to join the Marines?
I think they made it about probably 6 or 8 months before they graduated, which would have been in '65. And they did a sign-up where you could, you know, go sign up, and as soon as you graduate, you're leaving kind of thing, and that's what they did. I'm not sure it would have all happened like that if it hadn't been the three of them, you know, kind of keeping each other on track with that.
Was there a specific moment where he sat you down and said, okay, this is what I'm doing now?
Well, actually, he said, we signed up today. Mm-hmm. So that's how I knew that it was final, that it was really going to happen.
And what was going through your mind?
I think I already knew he was going to. I was kind of surprised that it was that day, because I didn't know that. I think they just all left at lunch from school and went and did it, kind of on a lark almost, although they'd been talking about it. But it became more real then that it was really going to happen.
Do you know how his parents reacted?
Yeah, they did not want him to go at all. And they actually asked me to come over and then asked me to talk him out of it. And I refused, because I said it's his choice. You know, it's not right for me to use whatever pull I might have to do that. And I really thought that he would be really angry with me at some point if I did that. So that made it a little less comfortable with his family, because they very much didn't want him to go.
And did your parents have an opinion about it?
I don't, not that I could say specifically. I don't know what my dad thought. And my mother, of course, she's like, she didn't want him to go, you know, just like you wouldn't. You know. And I think all of the adults knew more about what was going to happen than we did.
He went into the Marines through the buddy system.
Yes.
Can you describe this system?
Well, as I recall it, the way it was that they could all sign up together, and if they did that, then they were supposed to be able to ship out together, you know, wherever one went, the other two would go. However, I'm not sure how much the Marines honored that, or something happened that two of them went straight to Vietnam, and one of them didn't. And I don't know if that was a choice that was made by the guy or what happened. But that's what they thought they were going to do. They thought they were all going to go in the service and go to the same training and then go to Vietnam together. That was their plan anyway.
What were his buddies like, and were you close with them?
I was not, I wouldn't call it close. I was, they were around, and like I said, small town, you grow up with people. One of them, I ended up marrying, and he's probably the least worthy of the three. Another one was very, very intelligent. His name was Steve, and he was super, super smart. And he's also the one that didn't go to Vietnam, so that might have something to do with that.
Where did Ronnie go to basic training?
He went to California. I guess it's probably oh God, what's the name of the one by San Diego, whatever it is. And then basic was, I keep thinking it was 15 weeks, and I think that's right. It eventually, they kept cutting it back because they needed more soldiers to go to Vietnam. But I believe it was 15 weeks at that time.
Do you remember what his specialty was?
No.
What kind of conversations did you and Ronnie have during this basic training period time?
Well, no conversations, but lots of letters. He talked a lot about the basic training. One thing I specifically remember is they had a tree or maybe a telephone pole kind of deal, and they all had to carry it up and down on the sand on the beach. And if they didn't do it fast enough or efficiently or whatever, they had to do it again. And I remember that was really hard, and he talked about that he thought it was pretty outrageous, I guess.
Did he ever mention how he was feeling about the war or going to the war?
I don't remember him talking about that other than we know we're going to go. It was just pretty much, especially if you were in the Marines, you were probably going to go to Vietnam. And I don't think he had a clue. I really don't. I don't think he knew what that meant. And he was really proud that he was good at learning to use weapons and all of that, So I think he still didn't know.
Did you find that he had changed after going to training? In what ways?
Well, he looked older when he came home. They always gave him a leave in between training and being shipped out. And this just happened to fall around the holidays in his case. And, of course, he wore his uniform, and his hair was cut short, and he was very clean cut and all of that. Seemed a little older, seemed more serious, I think. It was kind of cool to have a guy in a uniform, and he was a man now, it appeared, rather than the child that he was when he got on that bus.
Can you describe the day he left for Vietnam?
Like when he left to go back, yeah. Same thing, you put him on a bus. Before that, while he was home, he kept trying to talk me into running away and getting married. Because there's always a rumor that you could get married underage in Georgia. Whether or not that was true, then I don't know, but that's kind of what was passed around the high school. And everybody, of course, was thinking about getting married because of the Vietnam thing. And I just didn't want to do it. I wanted to go to college. And I guess I thought at that time that you couldn't be married and go to college or whatever. But I was like, what he really wanted was to have a baby. In case he got killed, he wanted a baby. And I just thought that sounded like pretty crazy to me, from my 16-year-old point of view at that time. And I just said, no, I want to go to college. And so we were a little at odds over that. But when he left, it was just sort of like it was the first time when he went off. I think he was a little more serious because they were just having fun the first time. But it didn't seem like it was forever, of course.
Do you remember the last thing he said?
I love you.
Did his opinion of the war change as he went?
I'm absolutely sure it did, but because he had, none of them did. They didn't know war, you know. But they were a different kind of man back then. They kept it to themselves. They were manly about it, I guess you'd say. He talked more about his friends, what they did, you know, when they were playing cards or listening to music, or he's always wanted to know what I was doing, you know, what's going on at school, what's going on back in the real world. He always called it the real world. He didn't talk about the Vietnamese people. A lot of things I read now, I see they talk a lot about the culture, and I didn't hear any of that, you know, at the time. It was more about plans for the future, you know, what it's going to be like when we get back together, that kind of thing.
And most of this was through writing letters to
It all was. There was no, you didn't get phone calls from Vietnam, or, of course, there was no email and all those things. This was pre-technology.
Did your opinion of the war change as you watched the news?
Well, I began to pay attention, and I would hear all these things, you know, on the news, and see all these protests, and I didn't take it personally like they do now, you know, like they think if you're protesting the war, you're protesting their son or their, you know, I didn't see it like that. Maybe some people did, but I saw it more as, this is big. You know, I was beginning to see this is more than, you know, just going away for a month or a year or whatever. And we counted the days. Everybody always counted the days, you know, until the day they were supposed to ship out and come back home. And so I think I began to see stuff on TV and wonder, but he didn't talk about that. He talked about the boredom, about the rain, about it was hot. You know, if he said, mostly he talked about when I get home, kind of things.
Do you think that the letters he wrote to you were different from the letters he wrote to, say, his mom or his friends?
Yes, because he also wrote to my mother. So I had access to that, and occasionally to my sisters. But yeah, they were love letters mostly. It was about creating a life.
How did your parents feel about your relationship with them as time went on?
My dad didn't like it. He was always concerned. They were always afraid, of course, that we were going to have sex and get pregnant and do all those things, which we never did. But my mother liked him a lot, and I think she just told me about a month ago that she was hoping when he came home on leave that we'd run away and get married. Who knew that? You know, I sure didn't have a clue that she was thinking that. But I think they were very, very watchful all the time. They were always expecting the worst, and it didn't happen.
You were 16 when you left for Vietnam.
Yeah.
How did this affect your development?
I think I'm an entirely different person than I would have been if there was no war. Who knows? I probably would have been a housewife in Selma, Indiana with a bunch of kids, and, you know, probably, I don't know what would have happened, of course, but starting then, I became sort of an activist. Even then, I think I was the first woman to ever take drafting at our school, and I had to, like, fight for that because drafting was in a shop which was like about 4 or 5 blocks from the school, and it was all male teachers and all male students, and they didn't want a girl down there. But I was mad because they canceled journalism class, and so I decided they were going to give me something. And so to the detriment of my GPA, I took drafting. And Westinghouse actually came and talked to me and said, if you get through this, we want to hire you because we can't, the guys are all going to war. We don't have anybody. So this was kind of a beginning of me doing things a little bit different than the girls were.
Were there many soldiers from Selma in Vietnam at this point?
Yes, yeah. I mean, it was your fate, pretty much, you know, unless, you know, you happen to be the kind of kid that their parents were going to get them into a good school or something, and that's not, most middle-class kids weren't planning on going to college. They were planning on going to work. And all of my friends that were a little bit older than me all went to Vietnam.
Did the town stand behind the war along with its soldiers?
It just wasn't a big issue back then. It was, I think they stood behind the government. Up until this time, they expected the government to know what was best and to do what was best, and you didn't really criticize it much, I don't think. I didn't hear anything like, nobody was arguing about is it right or wrong. At that time, it was, we have to do what we have to do, and it was a big, we have to stop communism. That was the big issue, was we were all afraid, or the adults were afraid that the communists were going to come and make us be communists. So they saw it as a worthy cause in the beginning.
Did you feel different?
I didn't even know what that stuff was. I sort of knew what communism was, but now that I do know what it is, I really didn't. I thought it was really bad and scary, and that they were going to take over if we didn't stop them. And I think the wisdom was, we have to stop them somewhere. Let's stop them over there before they get to the shores of our country. And I really think that people believed that it was possible that they might get to the shores of our country.
As the war went on, did the atmosphere change?
Well, first it changed on TV. You began to see on the nightly news that there were protests all over the place, and it was just looked like a lot of really angry people, and they were certainly against the war, but it wasn't clear why, I don't think. And then it began to, we began to think and talk about it a little bit more, but still I don't think. They weren't protesting in Selma, most certainly, or Muncie, so it was like they're doing that in the cities. They're doing that far away.
How long was Ronnie in Vietnam before he was killed?
Not very long. He went back after Christmas, and he was killed in May. So he was there about 6 months, maybe 5 months.
What were the circumstances surrounding his death?
He went out on a patrol in the jungle. There were 12 of them, and the guy in the first person that was they were in a line. He stepped on a mine or a tripwire or something, and then there were snipers in the trees, and they killed them all.
Who told you about his death, and can you describe what you were going through?
I'll try. A friend of ours, of my brother's actually, he's a couple years younger than me, he came running into our house, and he said, "Berta, Ronnie got killed." And I said, "Oh, no, he didn't. That's crazy." And he said, "Yes, he did." And he happened to go to the same church as Ronnie's family did. So I ran to the minister's house, and he said, yes, that he was dead. And then it was going to be like 3 weeks before the body would come home. And it didn't seem real, I kept thinking, oh, they just think it's him, and, eventually he'll pop up and everything will be okay. And I really, I think even the parents thought that, because there's nobody dead there, So it was a time of waiting. For 3 weeks, everybody was kind of trying not to accept it, and we're waiting to see. So, and I just tried to be strong and not be a baby, and kept writing letters.
So, would you say that it really hit home once his body got back?
I think still, on one level it did, and I was very angry. I remember sitting, because it was a full color guard, military funeral, and I remember sitting in the church and hating the Marines that accompanied the body. I just, hated them. And, but it's still, because of course it was closed casket, and I still didn't have any proof that he was the one in the casket. And So it hit home in one way, and that's when I switched over to being angry. But I still was always expecting him to come home for probably 2 years. I always thought, someday I'm going to look up and he's going to be there. So I don't, that was my first death too. And so I really I don't see him dead. I don't see him. So I just thought he would come home.
And that was 1966.
6. Mm-hmm.
Now you said that 1968 was a watershed year for you. Why?
Well, that's when I was 18 and a senior. But it was also the series of assassinations of the Kennedy and Martin Luther King, for some reason, for me, was sort of a last straw. It was like, this country is out of control and wrong, There was also the students that were assassinated. I don't know what else you'd call it. They were killed. And by this time, I hated anything military. So that was just more proof to me that the military was a negative experience and a bad thing that our country did. By this time, it was all pretty much out in the open about Vietnam, and just, it changed from when I was a little child. Everyone thought the government was wonderful and good, and we're the best, most honest people in the world. And by the time I was 18, we began to see that wasn't true. There was a whole lot wrong with what was going on, and it needed to be watched and addressed. And so I think by the time I was 18, I was a pretty angry person and pretty cynical for an 18-year-old. I just didn't have much faith in the government.
Do you think that the graduates of 1968 had a different experience than those before or after?
Yes, I think so. Absolutely. We were kind of, up until us, we pretty much just did what we were supposed to do, I think, in general. We wore the clothes they told us to wear, and they were pretty strict with it, clothing. And we went to church. We did all the things we were supposed to do. Main difference to me is without question. We were questioned. We began to question why and who says and what's the point of all of this, So it began to be more of a generation that said, things need to change and we can do it. And I think that's still our attitude. I don't think much has changed. We've gotten old, but we still feel that way.
Where did you attend college after graduating?
Well, after graduating, I didn't go to college. I had scholarships to go to Earlham College in Richmond, and could have come here. The Mrs. Warner, who was the wife of the Warner Gear Warners, sort of took an interest in me and wanted to put me through school. But I chose Earlham of the two schools, mainly just because I wanted to get away, like typical 18-year-old. But about this time, when I was preparing to go to college, Ronnie's friend, Ron, who went with him to Vietnam, came home. And he told me that Ronnie told him to take care of me if anything happened to him. And I bought into that pretty completely, because that'd be nice if that were true. And so we ended up, I got pregnant and we got married. And he asked me not to go to college during that time. And I said, okay. Whatever he wanted. I don't know if that had anything to do with I wouldn't do it for Ronnie, and that turned out to be pretty bad. But, so I didn't go to college then. I went, finally, when I turned 30, I mostly worked in restaurants and those kind of jobs. And I was working in a restaurant, and it was my 30th birthday, and I said, this is crazy. I need more. And this is the year it's going to change. And so I went to IU at Kokomo and got my bachelor's.
I want to go back to your relationship with Ron. What was the relationship like in the beginning when you were still so wholeheartedly, trying to think that, Ronnie did this for me?
I think I never for 1 minute thought I was in love with him. And I think with him it was pretty much sexual. And he was back from Vietnam. He was messed up. There's no other way to talk about it. He drank a lot and may have been doing drugs. At that time I didn't know that, and I wouldn't have known it if you showed it to me. He was pretty crazy. My dad absolutely hated him. They got in a fight, a physical fight at one point, because he would show up at my house at 3 a.m. and holler for me, and honk his horn, and I, being the idiot that I was, would go out, and my dad was just, you just didn't do that. It was totally disrespectful of me and the family and the whole thing. So it was not a good relationship, but I was by this time, resigned to, I don't know what I would have said then, except that just, who cares? I didn't expect much.
Why do you think you let the relationship happen?
It was pretty self-destructive. Almost, I can look back now and say I was intentionally shooting myself in the foot here, so I didn't go to college. I didn't do all the things that I could have done. It was almost, I don't know why I did that, but I think it was really self-destructive, and even there was a part of an intentional self-destruction there.
What kind of experiences did he have in Vietnam, if he spoke to you about them?
He spoke a lot about it, and I actually, another reason I didn't like him was when they were in Vietnam, he never actually went out on the patrols and did all of that. He had a desk job, and so I was kind of resentful of that. Somehow he always managed to slide through and be in the safest, any place could be dangerous, but the safest of all the jobs. And he was just kind of crazy, and so but I remember always, every time he'd say something about that, I'd be really angry at him, because I thought they had an agreement and they should have stuck to it.
So do you think he suffered from PTSD?
I know he did. He went back to Vietnam a second time. When I was pregnant for my second son, he just went and joined the Army. He was a Marine the first time, and he joined the Army and came home and said he was shipping out like in the next day or so. And we lived in Michigan at the time, and I was about 8 months pregnant, I think, and had a 2-year-old. And so he just went off to the war again. And this time I think that it was pretty bad for him. He had a couple of mental breakdowns, and they eventually shipped him back and shipped him to some kind of a hospital, and I don't think it was a mental hospital, but part of it was mental issues and probably drug addiction, because he was definitely addicted to drugs when he came home the second time.
So what was it like living with somebody like that?
It was terrible. It was awful. By this time now, he was either smoking dope every day. I sewed all my baby clothes and I embroidered them, and you can see where I got high from the smoke in the room, because the stitches would get really crazy and I'd have to take them out the next day. But he smoked all the time, and he liked to run, but he would have these what we now know was small seizures, and forget where he was, and forget how to get home. He'd have short-term memory loss, and I just attributed it all to drugs, not knowing that there was anything medically wrong with him. I just thought, what a loser, But it was really bad, and I couldn't wait to divorce him. I had actually planned to divorce him and found out I was pregnant for my second son, and back then you couldn't get divorced. You had to wait, I think it was 3 months after the birth before you could divorce. So I had a countdown from that day on that I was going to divorce him.
Now, I know your children were young, but do they ever talk about remembering some of these instances?
Well, they don't remember that stuff, of course. But when they were in their teens, they wanted to go to Germany with their father. He was still at this point in the Army. And so I thinking, and this was when I was in college, and I was thinking what a wonderful, time for them to get to go to Europe, and they were going to be in Germany, and what a wonderful experience. But it ended up the Army shipped the boys back home because he was neglecting and abusing them, and they ended up kicking him out of the Army. At this point, he had 17 years altogether with the Marines and the Army, but they threw him out because he was getting arrested by the Germans, and that was really not something that they wanted their soldiers to do, was to have confrontations with the police there.
Do you remember what he had confrontations with?
It was drunkenness and a couple times, I think, maybe fighting with his family or, domestic violence kind of things. But when they sent him home, it had to do with, and they actually took the boys and held them until they could fly them home, because apparently it was really bad. So they do know what he was like, and they still have a sort of tenuous relationships with him. They see him maybe once a year, which is about all they ever saw him their whole lives anyway, because the only time he came would be when he was in between wives or women or whatever. And he would call lots of times and say, I'm going to come pick the boys up, and not show up. And so it was really he wasn't much of a father ever. But they do have a sort of relationship with him now. He lives in Texas.
Do you ever speak to him?
Not if I can help it. I don't have anything really to say to him. The boys think I'm still mad at him, but I'm not. I just, he's not the kind of person I want to hang with.
So, would you say that was the last straw? Then the boys coming home?
Absolutely. Like well, I'd already divorced him long before that. The last straw was when he came home on leave, he was at Fort Campbell for some reason, waiting, he'd come back from somewhere. Or no, might have been in basic or something, but he was at Fort Campbell, and he came home on leave when Carrie, my youngest son, was born, and he didn't come to the hospital to see me or Carrie. He just partied with his brothers. So I was like, yeah, I'm on the right track here, getting this divorce.
How did he feel about your anti-war stance at this point?
Probably the same way he still does. He doesn't like it. Nobody likes it. That's my family's pretty much. My younger sister retired from the Army. She's gung-ho all the way, Army. She was in the Army for 22 years. My oldest son retired from the Army. He retired about a year ago. So they know it. And my son said when Desert Storm started, he said to his friends, he said, I know where my mom's at. She's protesting somewhere. And I was in San Francisco marching on the federal building. But they just sort of think it's one of those, I don't know, they think it's kind of the cute thing Mom does, but I'm very serious about it.
And how did it feel to have, one of your sons go into this life?
I don't like it at all. And I don't like, at the time when he went in, I sort of thought, oh, good, it's going to keep him out of trouble. But it actually didn't keep him out of too much trouble. He was almost killed during basic training because he's kind of a smart aleck attitude that always shows on his face, and his drill sergeants didn't appreciate it. So they put on this, made him put on a germ warfare uniform thing and do push-ups, and he threw up inside the thing and aspirated it, and it was really bad. But his father was still in the service then, or had just gotten out, and he called his dad, and his dad called the head of the base. And what happened was his drill sergeants that ruined their careers, a couple of them got kicked out, and so all of his career he's been aware of that other drill sergeant that knows he's out there somewhere, and their paths have crossed a couple of times. But he eventually they whipped him into shape, and he became a soldier, and he's the typical soldier's political attitude with a little bit of my liberalism thrown in there.
So, how long did the marriage last in total?
About 3 years. Only because I couldn't get divorced sooner, because I was pregnant.
You went to college in 1980, right?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
And why was this important for you?
Because I should have gone to college. I've always been the smart one, the one that made the best grades, all of that in school. Everybody thought of me as the brain. And because I just needed more, and I knew I should do more than what I was doing. And even then, I went in as a labor studies major, which was studying the relationship between management and labor from the labor point of view. So I was, taking train rides to Washington and marching on Washington during the Reagan years a lot. So it was still a form of protesting the system.
So you have been working to help abused women and troubled adolescents since the 1980s. Have you found that your own experience has helped you do that well?
Yes, particularly really all of it. But when I worked at the women's shelter, it was a safe house, and I was in charge of groups because you had to have been an abused woman to run groups there. That was their policy. And I absolutely knew. I understood. I wasn't one of those people that says, why don't you leave? I understood why it takes 7 times to leave, So I think it just, they instantly knew that I knew what was going on. And I think it helped me also to be pretty safety conscious, and I was aware of what can happen. And a lot of the people that volunteered or that worked there had no clue.
Why do you think it's important to not only explore the lives of Vietnam veterans, but also the lives that they left behind?
Well, I think it's important to explore the lives of Vietnam veterans because they seem to need that. They seem to always think that, and it's probably true, that people just wanted it to go away, and that meant they had to go away, So I think it's important to give them that opportunity that they didn't know how to take back then. Because men, you didn't whine if you were a man. You just sucked it up and kept it to yourself. And so I think for their health, they need it. And for the rest of us, I think it changed us too. It changed what we could have been or would have been. And so to tell that story is part of the story, because they came back and the only people to heal them were us. They didn't really have a lot of support because the government just wished it would go away. And I think as well as the public, they wanted some peace in the country, and they wanted this stuff to stop and all the protesting and all the war. So it was left to us to try to mend their spirits. And that's just part of the story.
What do you hope one learns from your experiences?
Well, the first thing that comes to mind is that war is hell. And I think younger people have been, even though there's been wars going on, they're so remote, I don't think they have a clue, just like I didn't, although I think younger people now it's more in your face everywhere, but it becomes, if you watch it so long all your life, you become jaded to death and to, numbers. The numbers are just today's numbers, but that there's other ways to resolve conflict, and it's a huge world of just people. And whoever would have thought that my neighbors would be Vietnamese people, given the way it was back then, the names that they were called, and I just, not knowing any better, just thought that's okay. And you know, the way things have changed, I don't think they understand the horrors of war. And I don't want them to know, but I want them to think about a different way of solution.
Well, I thank you so much for your time, and I think your story is very important to tell.
Thank you so much.
And just thanks all around.
Oh, you're welcome.